Hello and welcome to another episode of Vintage Pens for the Modern User. In the series of videos that I've been creating, the intent is to explore how someone who uses fountain pens every day and may only have decided to use modern pens so far may want to explore vintage fountain pens as an option for everyday use. We know that when these pens were first made, they were the writing instrument and the only means of communication at the time. Typewriters, of course, existing, as well as pencils. However, most correspondence was done through the use of a fountain pen and were used commonly in daily tasks. Therefore, for someone who wants to use a fountain pen daily, there is absolutely no reason why the modern user shouldn't consider all the advantages that a vintage fountain pen has to offer, since that is exactly the function those pens were intended to execute. Today we're going to take a closer look at the Waterman 52 fountain pen. The Waterman 52 fountain pen first began as the Waterman 12 PSF. In 1915 or thereabouts, Waterman came up with their lever filling mechanism, and it was introduced to what were then dropper filling fountain pens. The Model 12 was a dropper filled fountain pen, and the designation PSF was added to the end of the Waterman 12 to designate it as a self-filling fountain pen. Again, the mechanism of the lever allowing the pen to fill with ink without the user having to use a dropper and fill it that way. That gave rise in about a couple of years, 1917 or so, to simply the Waterman 52. Waterman came out with a sort of a coded system of numbers that were stamped on the ends of their pens that helped users identify what the pens were in terms of their size, in terms of the nib, in terms of the trim options that could be had. This numbering system can be rather complex, and I'm not going to go into great detail with it today. I'm simply going to show you the basics of the Waterman 52 and how you can use it and enjoy it with your everyday writing. So let's dive in and take a closer look. So here we have in front of us a Waterman 52 fountain pen. Now, Waterman made their fountain pens at the time, as did all others, out of hard rubber. This is black hard rubber. Today, some people know it as ebonite. Vulcanized hard rubber gave a lot of opportunities in manufacturing to making different objects. It was hardened, and it was very, very reliable material and a very stable material. So Waterman used this in their early fountain pens, which were dropper-filled pens as mentioned, and continued to use it throughout the 30s, even as others started to move into more modern plastics, celluloids, and the like. This is a very charming pen. The chasing on these pens can wear. Finding one that is nicely chased is always desirable, but again, if we're talking about finding a fountain pen simply for everyday use, I wouldn't be too fussed about whether or not it has chasing. If you can see here on the barrel some of that chasing, it's harder to see at a distance as it does wear. These pens had nickel trim on them. They also had a gold-filled trim, and you could even have solid gold trim options on the pen. Some of them had cap bands, some of them had barrel bands, a single barrel band, potentially double barrel bands, and some of them had more intricate overlays. So we'll talk through some of that in detail. But while I have this pen in my hand, I'll show you the numbering system there on the bottom. If you can see it clearly, it is marked 5.2 1/2. So the 5 was the lever filler, and the 2 was the size of the nib, a number 2 nib that was used by Waterman. The half size was a slimmer pen as opposed to the standard size fountain pen. So as with all fountain pens, modern and vintage, they came in a lot of different sizes to suit a lot of different users' preferences and needs. These were threaded caps, as were most vintage pens at the time. The term safety pin was actually first given to pens that had threaded caps to let the users know that the cap would not come off if you were to place it in your pocket or in your purse. That thread providing safety to prevent any leaks in the pocket. Safeties later became designated as a type of dropper filling pen with a unique mechanism. We won't explore that today, but here we have a very nice, very lovely open nib. These were gold nibs. They were not usually stamped at the time in the United States, but they are 14 karat gold nibs typically found in these fountain pens. They also had, in addition to black hard rubber, red hard rubber, which is more difficult to find and likely not something that someone who is intending to use the pen every day would necessarily want to acquire. They are more collectible, and the red hard rubber was less stable and more prone to developing cracks and deteriorating if not taken care of. They also used mottled hard rubber, which was a mixing of the red hard rubber and the black hard rubber together. And sometimes it was done in a ripple pattern. As you can see, the way the material was mottled together sort of formed a very nice ripple grain pattern, which you can see here on this. This pen is marked, not sure how legible it is, but it says 0752. The 0 and the 7 indicate that this is a gold-filled band on this pen here in the middle of the barrel. This again shows you the difference in the size. Both are Waterman's 52. The black ebonite pen in my left hand being a half size, which designated again a slimmer pen, and the ripple mixed hard rubber pen here in my right being the standard size 52. Again, both actually denote, both have that nice trim on the barrel band there. Very lovely, very pleasing, and very comfortable fountain pens in the hand. To give you a look at another code that you might see, and the difference as well between a rippled pattern, which you can see very nicely here in my right hand, and something that was simply called mottled hard rubber. In my left hand, this shorter fountain pen is a regular mottled or mixed hard rubber versus the ripple pattern. So you can see the difference. The pen also in my left now, you can see, is slimmer, so it would be denoted with the half size. It has a band on the cap, not on the barrel, and it is shorter. So this pen would be given the designation of a V at the end to denote it was intended for the vest pocket. They were also sometimes worn by women on a nice chatelaine, on a necklace or something of that nature. So they were suitable for men to put with their pocket watch chains in a vest pocket, or also by women to use on a chain on their neck or in a purse. You can find V-sized pens, Vest 5 pens, with clips as well. Not necessarily as common, but they are out there. And here again to show you, as best as I can, the numbering on the bottom. 5.2 1/2 with a V. So again, that's a 52 pen in the half size, meaning slender, and V meaning for vest pocket. All of these pens have what's known as a box lever mechanism. It was different from the spring lever mechanisms that other pen manufacturers made. It was Waterman's patent for their own use in their own pens. Let's see a couple different other options that you might find. I mentioned some overlays. Here we have a nice sterling filigree overlay. This is over the top again of that black hard rubber. This pen you can see compared to the one in my left is slimmer, so it is a half size. So it's similar here. Both of these are the same size pens. One simply has a nice sterling overlay. You could also find them with gold filled or even solid gold overlay. The numbering system again would distinguish the overlay. In the hundreds digit, a 4 was for sterling, and a 5 in the hundreds digit was for gold. A 0 in the thousands digit before the 5 told you that it was gold filled, not solid gold. So here we see on the bottom of this pen, if we can find it, try to make sure it's legible. This says 4.52 1/2. 4.52 1/2. Again, sterling 52 in the half or slender size fountain pen. All of these pens do have delightful nibs in them. Many of them you will find can be flexible. and we'll discuss that as we get to using a fountain pen. Let me return again here to this pen and show you as well that you can find pens and pencils. Waterman made pens and pencils together as sets. And so some collectors do like to have both, and Waterman knew that, and Waterman provided that. So if you wanted to find a 52, you could find a 52 and likely find a 52 pencil to match. Two other small pens here just to show you the options. Here we have a 0, 5, 5, 2, and a half V. So again, the 0, 5 in the thousand and hundredths designates gold filled. The 5 in the tenths tells you it's a lever filler, and the 2 in the ones tells you that this has a number 2 sized nib. And this is a half size, it is thinner, which is typical of V pens, although not always found. You could also find V pens that were full sized. So here, if we can see, we have 0, 5, 5, 2, and a half V. This is also known as the filigree pattern. Very lovely, very ornate overlay on a metal pen. And you could also find in a 4, 5, 2 and a half V here, I have a sterling overlay as well. This you will see is fully overlaid, and this is a hand engraved pattern. And these can be found again in the full size, full length pens. So what I have here are the shorter size pens, but it's quite remarkable the workmanship and the craftsmanship that is done. This was hand engraved, not machine done on this pen. And so if you can imagine the hours it took to execute such a lovely design, even the lever itself has been engraved on this pen. So remarkable craftsmanship when we look at early fountain pens, and one of the reasons I tend to be a proponent of vintage fountain pens is the level of craftsmanship, the quality of workmanship. Again, these writing instruments were designed for everyday use, and they were designed to last for many, many years, really a lifetime of a user. And now we've preserved them for a second, third, and potential fourth lifetime. One other pen before I write with them is a 55, which in my first video when I talked about using vintage fountain pens, I had this pen here. So the Waterman's numbering system, as I said, 2-digit numbering system. In the tens, the 5 tells you we have a lever filling mechanism. In the ones digit, we tell you the size of the nib. So a 52 here in my left hand would have a number 2 size nib, and a 55 would have a number 5 size nib. You could find a 52, a 54, a 55, a 56, even a 58. You should know, if you are getting into these vintage Watermans, that the larger the nib, that the price will increase proportionately to that. And the barrel size does start to increase. You can see there's not much difference in the barrel between the 52 and the 55, but if I were to have a 56 and certainly a 58 in my hands, you would notice that the barrel size also begins to increase as the nib size increases. There's not a whole lot to show when you disassemble one of these fountain pens. I have disassembled this one in the past, and yet it is not wanting to come. We've gotten cooler weather here, and so I'm not going to pull it apart. So there's not a whole lot to show. Hard rubber is a very good material. It can be brittle, but when heated, it is very malleable, and it can return to any form that it had previously. So if you've unfortunately managed to do some damage through heat, you can return the pen through heat again to its original state. As a result, when you disassemble these pens, it's always advisable to use a dry heat source here to remove the section from the barrel. Without doing so, I'll just tell you, we have the section, we have the nib, we have the feed, we have the barrel, we have the box lever here, and inside, of course, a sack is connected to the end of the section and fills the whole barrel of the pen. And when you work this box lever up and down, on these pens you have to work it up and back down because it's not spring loaded. It will compress the sack inside and then allow you to get a nice fill of ink. As stated in the other video when I gave the introduction, if you are to encounter one of these pens that's not been restored, it's best not to touch the lever at all. Hardened sack inside can do significant damage to the lever and the stress points on the side where the lever bar attaches to the box assembly are very weak, and you can wind up breaking this lever box, and they are replaceable, but the parts are not out there as much as they once were, and it is a costly repair. It's a time-consuming repair. It's an advanced repair, and so better off to let it be if you don't know whether it's been restored. If you're buying a pin from somebody, I always advise modern users to find a reputable dealer who has restored and can guarantee their pins will work well for you. If you're able to hold it in your hand and you're working with somebody, ask them first. Even have them demonstrate that the lever will work properly before handing it to you to allow you to use and test the pin. Speaking of using and testing the pin, that is what we do here on Vintage Pens for the Modern User. So, this lovely Ripple 52 with the nice barrel band is the one we're going to use today. It's quite an elegant pen, and it's very, very usable. I mentioned this material has been known by some to be fragile, and you get people who are really concerned, but if you handle your pens well and care for your pens well, there's really no reason not to use a Vintage 52. So unscrewing it, of course, finding your paper. I don't spend a lot of time talking about paper and inks because I assume most of you who are users have probably spent more time on that than I. But of course, finding nice fountain pen paper will yield you the best results. And as always, I recommend finding a good, reliable, pH neutral ink. I use Waterman's ink almost exclusively in my fountain pens. Occasionally I'll use Pelican ink. But as we have a Waterman's fountain pen here, well, then we should use a Waterman's ink. So we lift the lever and place it back down. Nice, simple operation. There's no reason to do it more than once, but I'll do it a second time simply so you can see. Getting your fingernail under, you lift the lever up into its fully extended 90-degree position, and then you place it back down gently. It doesn't take long for an ink sac to fill with ink. So you don't really need to hold the pen into the inkwell more than perhaps a few seconds. As always, I advise closing the inkwell first, lest you are left with an inky mess that nobody really wants on their hands or in their laps. You can post these pens. They're quite lovely, quite capable of being posted. You don't have to post hard. I wouldn't post hard. Gently and securely, because of the nature of hard rubber, it does grip itself rather well. Now, for those who have seen me do these videos in the past, you know that I am an overwriter, and I tend to come up above to write with pens. And you can do that even with the vintage Watermans, as I'm demonstrating here. Because when you use a fountain pen, one of the first things that you should know is let the pen do the work. Pens write under their own weight. Okay, and oftentimes in modern society, we're accustomed to ballpoints. Ballpoint pens do not write under their own weight. You have to press into the paper aggressively. It's horrible, and it wears out your hand. And that is one of the reasons why fountain pens are becoming so popular, because we've discovered that you can write with a pen and you can really minimize the strain and stress of lengthy writing periods because the pen is doing all the work. These pens write under their own weight. Now, as mentioned before, sometimes when you get a vintage fountain pen like this, you will find it to have a flexible nib. I'm going to talk more about flexible nibs in another video, but what you should know is if you have to push it, you probably don't have a flexible nib. Flexible nib requires nothing more than some gentle pulling into the paper. And as I'm not an underwriter, I don't do a great job of exploring this, but I'll give you an example. So you can see as I pull towards the paper, the tines do separate out nicely, and they provide me much different line variation. If I were to do some capital letters, for example, my upstrokes and my side strokes be very different from my downstrokes, okay? And the less you pull, especially on the upstrokes, you don't pull at all on the upstrokes, you pull on the downstrokes. You pull on the downstrokes gently into the paper and down, and then you're up again very lightly, and you can get that nice variation. Waterman's feeds are nice and wet, as they would be expected to be, to keep up with the flexible writing that they can do. They will not blob, they will work well for you, and I would encourage you to try one out, okay? This is an early pen, again, from about 1917 through the 1930s. They are plentiful in a variety of colors, and I would encourage you to take a closer look at vintage Waterman's 52 series fountain pens. As you can see, there are some stunning options available for you, and I would hope that any modern user would now know that this is a good pen to add to your collection, to be enjoyed, to be loved, and it's over 100 years old, and there's something about that provenance having it in your hand. So please do explore the Waterman 52 fountain pen.